Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we have David Kessler on, and he's talking about his book, Finding Meaning in the Sixth Stage of Grief. So, welcome, David.
Hi there. Good to be with you.
Great having you here. This is perfectly timed, I think. I read your book as I was telling you, and and I started reading just the introduction and was crying, and I thought, oh, I guess there's something still more for me to learn
Right.
about my own grieving process. So,
Well, and that's such an important point, and I'm glad you said that and sort of own it because we like to pretend that like the grief is maybe in the book or it's in the room or it's in the therapist's office, and the reality is we carry it with us. So I'm glad the book was a bit of a vehicle for you to release a little of yours.
yeah, thanks a lot, David.
I know, right? Right.
I wasn't expecting it, but it did. It did
But
bring
isn't
up.
that interesting how grief works? That we don't realize there's stuff sitting in us wanting to get attended.
Yeah, I think that is
So
very
you're
true.
demonstrating that right up front.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that I was the case study.
Right, right.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about, for people who aren't familiar with the first book that you co-authored with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross on grief and grieving. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with her and what the
Sure.
sixth stage is.
So Elizabeth is obviously the pioneer, legendary person who did the 5 stages of death and dying in her first book in 1969, which shockingly just came out in a 50th anniversary edition. It's amazing it's been 50 years. Those stages for the dying were getting misused and put on people who were grieving. And Elizabeth had never had a chance to formally adapt them. And we had written a previous book called Life Lessons and enjoyed working together. And Elizabeth asked me to work on this book called On Grief and Grieving, where we adapted her stages of dying from dying to grief. Right on page 1. On page 1, we said, these stages, and they are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We said they're not a map for grief. They don't have to be linear. You don't have to do them in order. We don't follow them. They reflect where we are. Up front, we said that. And Elizabeth was a very rule-breaking, organic, messy, come as you are sort of person. And since her death, these stages have sort of become 5 easy steps to grieving, which would have appalled Elizabeth. I mean, obviously, there's nothing easy about grief. Now, the good thing is when people hear these 5 stages, it takes something like grief that's so unknown and makes them think, oh, there's a something to this. There's a structure I can lean on. But they still have gotten so misinterpreted. And for me personally, acceptance took on a finality, like you would find some acceptance and be done with grief, which I can tell you, her and I never intended that. So that's where the idea of, is there a 6th stage that we're looking for, after we have some challenges with acceptance, might there be more? And I believe there is, and I think it's the 6th stage of grief meaning.
Okay, so I just wanted to go back and said, so you said it was misused and that it's not linear. And can you repeat the 5 stages again? It's
Sure. Denial, which is I can't believe they're gone.
right.
I can't believe they're not here. My spouse, my dog, my child, my husband, my wife, my partner, my parents were supposed to be with me on this road. So it's the I can't believe they're gone. Then anger. Many times, a lot of us deal with anger after a loss. Bargaining is all the what ifs, the regrets, if onlys. And then depression is the sadness we feel that they're gone. And then acceptance. And acceptance isn't that we like that they're gone or that we're okay they're gone. Acceptance is just acknowledging the reality
Mm.
that they are gone.
And then what is meaning? The new stage that you've talked
So,
about.
meaning is how, after they die, we can begin to look for more. Now, a couple of things about that. We don't find meaning in the death. You know, people die tragically, they die unexpectedly, they die when we don't want them to. There's no meaning to be found in the death, but there is meaning to be found after the death. The meaning after the death, we've all heard of people who have started large organizations or charities or really worked on some great cause, and that's huge meaning. But there's small meanings that can mean the world to us. So a meaning could be you're changed by knowing them. You're changed by their life. Not that their death had the meaning, but their life had the meaning. You can go on to live a life that honors them. Maybe their death helped us understand the brevity and value of life. Maybe they died tragically in a way we don't want other people to die that way. So we're going to work hard to change the world so that other people don't continue to die that way. So there's a million ways to find meaning.
So I'm going to share my own personal story.
Sure.
And I want you to share your beautiful story in
Okay.
the book that made me cry. So my dad died, oh gosh, like over 26 years ago. And he died, I kept on putting off seeing him. We both...
Tell me his first name if you don't mind.
David. David.
David.
Yeah. So
Okay.
we
And the reason I like to ask is when I talk about people, sometimes we talk about a loss. Your dad is more than a loss. He is dad.
Yeah.
He is David.
Yeah.
So I want to know David, not just your loss.
Yes.
So I always say to people, what's their first name? So thank you.
Thank you. So he died, and we kept on putting off seeing each other, and I wanted him to meet my boyfriend at that time, now husband. And we were both too busy at work to actually, he was busy publishing a book. I was busy working at Microsoft at the time, and it's always like something more important just kept on coming up, so we kept on delaying. And so finally, I had decided to go visit him with my then boyfriend, now husband. And my husband was going to ask my father for my hand in marriage. And sadly, my dad died 2 weeks before not only the last chapter of his book that he'd been planning his whole retirement on writing his book. He was, I think, 1 or 2 chapters short of finishing the last chapter of his life's work. So he died of a heart attack before that happened, before, my... and it's making me sad just talking about it. You and your accepting and holding. Look what you've done to me on air. Okay, and then no, what I've done to myself. Okay, so.
But let me tell you, those tears are evidence of love.
Yeah.
His love still lives within you.
That's true.
And I can see that. I mean, how great is that? His love is alive within you.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So he died in this kind of tragic way, because I know it would have made him happy to finish his book. It would have made him happy to meet my husband, who he would have loved and cherished, just like I do. And it's always it just got me. Like, how can someone die like in this manner? So it's the tragically died in a way. And, it took me actually just recently that I thought, it took me until recently to realize that I've spent my whole last chapter of my, like the last 20 years of my life, making meaning out of that death.
And what is the meaning, can I ask?
Yeah, my own interpretation is like, never wait to do the thing that you love to do. Like, he really wanted to write this book ever since I was a little girl, I remember him wanting to finish and write a book. And
Right.
then and he kept on delaying, like, I'll do it during retirement, I'll do it during this, I'll do, and then, and
We all have that. There's going to be
yeah.
time.
And to be 2 chapters away, and this is like a monolithic book. It's probably like a 600 environmental handbook on how to protect the environment. So it's like
Wow.
a gigantic, it's a tome. It's been split up into 6 books because it's so prolific.
Wow.
So he wrote this book, and one of the questions from the listeners is, did I finish it? I couldn't because I don't have the technical expertise. If I could, I would try to finish it. But I think I am finishing his book in some weird way by the work that I'm doing, which is trying to not have people delay doing things that they love, and to recognize the things that they love earlier in life, and
Right.
not to wait. And I haven't, like, I have not, I feel like as a result of that, as a result of his death, he gave my life new meaning, because I was going to live my life fully. I was never going to have, as like, we all have regrets, but like, I was going to live in a
Right.
way that I fully engaged in everything I love doing,
Right.
and not worry about whether it makes other people happy, etc. And one question came in: Did the book did get published? It's out, and actually, my contractor's like, this is your dad? I read this book all the time."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's really cool. So it kind of made me feel like, okay, his work still has impact and meaning, especially in the world where there's a lot of environmental
And
impact.
think about everyone who watches this
Yeah,
today and forever on is going to know David Liu.
yeah, yeah.
And so the meaning isn't just what you did. The meaning is what you're doing right here, right now.
Hmm.
This is a meaningful moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
And,
my whole life with that.
and part of the work in helping people realize that grief is about pain. Of course, there's pain. We all understand that. Meaning does not take away the pain. I can't take away the pain of your dad dying. Can't do it. No one can. But we can find meaning that becomes a cushion.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning is also the love that's there in addition to the pain.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's at the lectures I do, the retreats, and the book, the courses, I want people to find out there's more in grief than just pain.
Mm-hmm.
And our work is to remember that person in our own way, at our own pace, with more love than pain.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about your book about suffering, and it's the whole Buddhist idea of, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
Correct.
What's your take on that with your experience with grieving?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I can't ever take away anyone's pain. But suffering is what our mind does.
Mm-hmm.
Suffering is our mind blaming us, telling us we didn't do it right, we should have done more, we should have done less, we're grieving wrong, we're grieving right, we're grieving too much, we're not grieving enough, why aren't you crying? I mean, I could go on and on with the craziness that our mind does. And our mind, wouldn't it be great if after we had a loss, our mind said, oh my gosh, you've had a loss. I'm going to be extra tender, extra loving. No, our mind doesn't do that. Our mind kind of goes, yeah, you're to blame. And by the way, if you've got any old wounds, I'm going to grab them, because now's a really good time to bring any of your old wounds into this. So I can't take away someone's pain, but I can help them with all that suffering, all the old wounds, all the what ifs, all the regrets, all that stuff that comes up.
So it's a couple things happened. I took a writing class when my eldest son left for college. And interestingly, I think to tag on to what you're saying, my unresolved grief from my dad came in the form of another loved one now leaving me for college. And then I started writing whatever kind of came up. And I kept on writing the same story over and over again, and it was this unresolved, like, I don't understand why this happened over and over. And I didn't realize it until I'd pull excerpts, like, I think I wrote this before, and then I like wrote it like 6 times. And you mentioned something like that in the book. If you find yourself telling the same story over and over again about some experience that happened,
Right.
and the fact you just talked about, and here I had a tag along kind of similar kind of grief of my son, my dear loved one, leaving for college. And so it was interesting how I realized that it was actually related to unresolved grief of my dad. So how does that all happen?
Sure. So a couple of things there. One, our job is to witness our grief. In our modern world, we want to fix it. We want to minimize it. We want to help you see the bright side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And our job is to witness it.
Mm-hmm.
Our job is also to witness our own grief. I mean, the truth is, we all want the people around us to get our grief, to understand our grief. They often miss the mark. And I tell people who are just desperately trying to get their husband, their sister, their wife, their brother to understand their grief, I say it's your job to honor your grief. No one knows the relationship, the loss you've had like you do. So one of the most powerful ways, and this is why I do so much and write about this, to honor our grief and witness our own grief is in writing. I do writing classes online around writing through grief and trauma, and I've had that as exercises in my own life. One of the things I wrote about that I think you might relate to your story is my mother died very tragically when I was 13, and she was dying in a sterile ICU while there was one of the first mass shootings in the US. And I had come out of that, obviously, in deep sorrow, deep grief, traumatized, victimized, and abandoned. It was not till I was probably in my late 20s or 30s that I sat down to write. And we all know our own story. I know how to tell my own story. I know how to write my own story. I decided to write my father's story. My father had not handled my grief well. I wrote his story. I had to sit with and write about what's it like to have your wife die? What's it like to not be able to afford a hotel? What's it like to be in a mass shooting while your wife's dying? What's it like to know you're going to be caring for this 13-year-old child that you have no clue how to do? All of a sudden, I went from having judgment for my father to compassion. Then I wrote my mother's story. What's her story? To be in this ICU, to be dying alone, to only get to see your husband and son 5 minutes every 2 hours. Where are they? Why can't they get in? Am I going to... all that she must have gone through. And when I wrote her story, for the first time, it dawned on me. Like at 30 years old, it dawned on me. I would have told you how my mother had abandoned me. For the first time when I saw it in print, I realized my mother died. My mother did not abandon me. Abandonment is what a child's mind does and sees it as something that we did wrong. So writing is so powerful to witness our grief. And for you, it's not my place to know your sort of details, but I would either guess, either one, from your father, you had some more grief to deal with, and when your child's leaving and it's empty nest, which is grief, it triggers that old...
Oh yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Triggers it.
Yes.
And sometimes, like me, you might have a little abandonment issue there.
Yeah.
That's an old wound that comes up.
Right.
So there's a lot that comes up. New grief triggers old grief.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's
we realize, oh, there's something there unattended.
right. So going back to kind of knitting this all together, what I'm hearing is that how important it is to witness the grief. And so for some reason, my writing it over and over again from my perspective, it was probably helpful at some point, but not really because I kept on writing it over and over again.
But if you didn't write it over and over again to create the pattern, you wouldn't have seen the pattern.
That's true. That's
So
true.
there's no wrong in this. We're all doing the best we can.
That's true.
You saw it when you were ready to see it.
Yeah. And so I saw like,
Right.
whoa. And actually, what happened after I saw it being written over and over again, I thought, I think I need to go get help because there's something in here that's like, there's something that's this
Right.
recursive. And what's interesting in the way that you did it is that you actually witnessed from different perspectives the same
Right.
event.
Right.
And that was what
Right.
allowed you to look at your story and the
Right.
beliefs that you created and say, wait a second, there's actually multiple stories here.
Right.
And
Right.
maybe the story that I created when I was at 13 is not really the full
It's
story.
not the reality. It's not the full story. There's more. Right.
Yeah, yeah. And so what's interesting is for me, I thought, well, I need to get some help. So I had heard of this woman, and miraculously or not so miraculously, um, a person told me about this class about grieving, and she said, she talked about something that you talk about in your book, Finding Meaning, and she had said that that your loved one never goes. And I have a spiritual teacher that says, honey, no one ever leaves. They're always here. Their spirit is always here. I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Like I've heard this 1,000 times, but I don't feel it. Like I don't feel their presence all the time. And so this class, you basically had someone witness you. They wrote down every single line.
Wow.
You told your story.
Right.
Wrote down every single
Right.
line
Wow.
of your story. It could sometimes take hours to tell the story.
Right.
And you just kept on going until you're like running out of steam.
Right.
And what was interesting about this is what she observed from this class is that very seldomly are we witnessed because someone talks about their grief and we're like, oh no, it'll be okay. They
Right.
run away.
Or me too. Or you know what I
Yeah.
did. Or you know what you should do.
Yes.
We're trying to fix each other, so absolutely. We don't know how to be witnesses and good listeners.
To just listen, not try to problem solve or like make it go away or do our own bargaining tonight.
I'd love to talk about something else you just said there.
Yeah.
And this is in the book too. When we talk about witnessing, our human experience versus our spiritual experience. So when someone says, you have no idea how hard it is to sit at the dinner table with an empty chair. And the other person goes, don't talk that way. They're always with you. So first of all, you were talking about your human experience, the longing, the yearning, the missing, and you deserve to be witnessed. And they sort of gave you a little spiritual appetizer there, like, no, they're always with you. You're fixed. And we end up getting mad at the people around us.
Right.
And so we don't realize that, we sometimes need to have our humanity witnessed. Other times we want it to be reminded of our spirituality. I in my own devastating grief, I had a friend who would call and I would talk about my loss, and she would say, and her realm was the spiritual realm, that's what she did, but she would always start by saying, do you want the human response or the spiritual? And first of all, it made me think, oh, what do I want? Second of all, I figured out that I would always say, I want the human response, then I want the spiritual.
Interesting. Okay, can you give me an example? Give me an example.
I want you to see the pain of not having someone I love at the dining room table. And for someone to go, David, that's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking that there's an empty chair at your dinner table. That's heartbreaking. Tell me more about it. What's that like? How are you doing? what a tragedy you're living with, to see that grief, to
Mm.
see the pain. Then if someone goes, all right, I want the spiritual, then it'd be great when you invite the spiritual in, or the religious, whatever it may be, or both for you. Oh my goodness, I don't believe death is the end. I do believe we're all connected. I do believe we'll be in touch again someday, somehow. But both deserve to be exist. Both deserve to exist.
Yeah. I think the ability to actually like to have the consciousness to ask what would best serve you at this point, because you really don't know. But I think
And the
actually,
person might not know either,
yeah.
And if someone's not sure, I always say start with the human.
Yeah, yeah, and it's what I'm hearing is the response that you really want is to get curious, like, well, what does it feel like when you're
Right,
at
right.
Thanksgiving dinner and there's like
There's
a
an empty
space?
chair.
Yeah,
Right,
how does
right,
it feel? And
right,
to have the person explain it, it kind of that helps them
right.
probably not be in denial about it or anger, whatever, even if they're not in any of those stages.
Well, then the person gets to just sit and feel their grief, and they're not distracted by someone telling them to think spiritually in their pain.
Yeah. It was interesting. So when I was writing this, I literally wrote down everything, and so you'd say like, okay, so um, you couldn't get into the ICU, and
Right,
then your father, you couldn't actually, so that someone was witnessing and writing down every single thing and
right,
repeating back to you. So you got witness
right,
once because they repeated and make sure that they understood everything correctly,
right.
and then they read the whole story all over
Wow,
again from beginning to end. So this takes like 4 hour, like 2 hours to maybe listen to the story, another hour to recap the whole story. And what was interesting is I do think that the person was, and in this protocol, she would find out the time, and she'd have like this music, healing music that would be, it was these binaural, I think they're called rhythms, so that um, you would have like some type of thing to kind of rewire your brain so that the thoughts that you get kind of stuck on, like you were talking about stories, would kind of like
right,
loosen up a little bit. And then you would go back and reread the story and see which things still felt highly triggerable. And then you would talk about those. And as you got deeper and deeper into those things, it would like unravel the little knots that you had in your head, whether it be
right,
abandonment or in my case, like anger that my dad wasn't there for for these important moments of my life, whatever it was.
sure.
It kind of, but it was really interesting the importance of witnessing and how important that is. Um, so in my case, like I've got meaning out of, my dad's death itself gave me a trajectory for my life itself. How about for you when you weren't able to go in and see your mom at her death? Like you were there, physically there, could have gotten in, the nurse didn't let you go into the ICU. Meanwhile, there's like a mass shooting and a fire across the street. I mean, how did you make meaning out of all of these things that seem so
It took it
chaotic?
took it took decades, obviously, and my whole career now, I feel, is brought meaning to those moments.
Yeah.
That I get to go into people's lives in some of the worst times now and help them. And that's not a trajectory I would wish on anyone, but it is the trajectory I got. And the meaning that I could make with it is to help it become a career that makes, people's lives a little easier when they're so hideous.
Yeah. I mean, what's powerful to me when I was reading about your biography, and I don't know if I have, please, I apologize if I don't get the order right, but
Okay?
you talk about this horrific situation with your mom. And then you talk about flying in the plane where there was a really kind pilot that allowed you to fly the plane. But in your own life, you got your pilot's license, you became an emergency
Right, I work with the police and
police.
the Los Angeles police, and work in managing hospital systems and in mental health and counseling. And I talk about, in some ways, I became the person that maybe could have helped me. that all those areas I was so out of control in, I tried to find some control, haven't found any control, but went on to find meaning
Yeah, through
and
that experience.
help people in a lot of different ways, right?
Yeah, had you not had those experiences as a child, you wouldn't have had the career trajectory that you had. And then
And I
same,
wouldn't be the same person
you
either.
wouldn't. And you wouldn't be able to help. Like I know that you, in the book, you talk about when people are in emergency scenarios like Katrina. I can't remember the ones that you've worked with,
Right,
and they've lost everything.
right.
And there are people who are not really caring or understanding, and you're that person, which how grateful. I can't even imagine how blessed they are to have you be that person. But
Well, there's many of me's out there.
I know, but how?
There's many of us doing all this work.
Yeah, I know. Not that you're like, but I'm
Right,
just saying. So
right.
when
No, right. But there's like just a bazillion frontline people that I always want to make sure I acknowledge for their work every day.
yeah, so when you're in those situations, like what can you explain maybe a situation and when all of this seeming like disparate training all of a sudden comes into a cohesive whole and a meaningful whole?
Well, I think in those moments, it really is being present,
Yeah.
being present with that person, whether they're showing me their home in Houston that has been just tragically destroyed and flooded,
Mm,
whether I'm standing at ground zero and everyone goes into silence because a finger has been found.
mm,
I mean, it's just that being present for the moment that's occurring.
mm.
I'm not trying to get that moment different or make it different. I don't have the power, but just to be there and witness. That's really part of the key to all this.
How do you and how do you witness when your own mind is like probably, you see a finger at during ground zero? I mean, how does one be present during, and there's and sadly more and more there are these school shootings,
Right.
there are these catastrophic weather events, people are losing everything,
Right.
people are getting traumatized by political things during the impeachment. How do you work with all that and be present during these chaotic times?
Well, for me, it's really about serving that person in front of me who happens to be in front of me at the moment.
Mm,
And that's sort of all we can do.
mm,
And to make meaning, when there's a school shooting, I don't want to just witness that. I want to think about what can I do to make a world where a school shooting doesn't happen? How does a school shooting occur? Are we handling people who are disenfranchised in our society well? When you hear that young man was quiet, not talking to anyone, not connected, did we ever think about not what's wrong with him, but what happened to him?
mhm,
Did we try to engage? What about our mental health laws? What about our resources for people who are mentally compromised? What can I do there? Are our gun laws what they should be? Whatever your politics are, there's unfortunately so much to be done. Can I just give some money to the Red Cross
mm,
to help in this?
mhm.
So it's that idea. We're clearly live. There's a little fax machine coming in.
Yes.
Who's got faxes anymore? And yet there is one. Um, so just that idea. Let me just turn it off here. So just that idea that life happens, and how can we be present for it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, even just using
Present.
the fax machine, right? To me, when I hear it, I thought, oh wow, there's like some deeper listening of some consciousness coming along to go, yeah, do you hear that? Those are the bells
Right.
ringing.
Right.
Because I think that when you go to, you have a tragic event, here's how I'm kind of processing it. You have a tragic event. It's like witnessing, like, wow, your house is gone. I can't even imagine what that must feel like. Or,
Right.
oh my goodness, what, like, what can I do? Or, whatever, whether it's individually witnessing that person or just being with them.
And, there's so many things that happen to us in this life. The other thing that the sixth stage is about for me is I had thought all those losses were behind me. I had thought, when I'm 80, friends and family are going to start to die. And I got a call that my younger son had unexpectedly died. And so I had to sit with this, and still do, with this just horrific tragedy of my son dying, and to not just be the grief specialist, but to be the bereaved parent. And I thought about my son David, and at one point I was literally sitting here in my office, and I had taken some time off work trying to figure out what to do. And I'm going through papers, and I found these chapters that I wrote on meaning. And I looked at them and I picked them up sarcastically, like, yeah, like this would help with this pain. And I began reading them, and they didn't take the pain away, but they helped me connect with him. They helped me remember him. And not long, probably a month or two after he died, also had a 43-year-old friend die. Someone else lost a parent. Someone lost their dog of 17 years. And I remember being with all my friends and family during all those events and them saying, how can you, with your son dying, even be consoling us? And I remember saying, all tears count. All of our tears count. People often ask me, which is the worst grief? I mean, I can make a case for all griefs being the worst grief. And certainly there's a huge case to be made when a child dies, it's out of order, it's unexpected. Absolutely. And I always tell people, your worst grief is yours, the one you're feeling. If your house just burned down, that is your worst grief. If your parent just died, that's your maybe worst grief in your lifetime. So it's always up to us to sort of identify our worst grief. And we unattend our grief sometimes by beginning to compare.
Yes.
And go, my grief doesn't count. Your grief counts. Your grief counts.
I think that's the hard thing, right? So my kids, I'm empty nesting. Oh yeah,
Right.
I have a grief, like, big deal. It has this it kind of has this arc to it. When I hear people who lost a child, it does feel like that doesn't really compare. So it's like, oh, just deal with, that's nothing in comparison to another person's grief. That's your son, a child dying earlier than you expect. That's like really not even in comparison.
Of course, but I want you to think about the idea of being present for ourselves. If you go home after work and every day you walked into your home and every day for 18 years there were 3 kids or 2 kids or 1 kid running around, and you walk in and there's no kids, and you have this feeling inside of you of sadness and emptiness, it would be crazy for someone to go, don't feel that way, kids have died in Sandy Hook.
Right.
Well, it's horrible, and we got to do something about kids dying in Sandy Hook. But in that moment, when you're alone in your house and 3 kids used to greet you at the door, you get to have your own feelings.
Right.
You get to be sad.
Right.
So somehow we've used grief to take away our feelings, and our feelings are important because they have them.
Right.
And as a bereaved parent, I would tell you, my grief is hideous, and it's brutal, and I miss my son. But you get to walk into your empty house and miss your kids. Mine doesn't take away from yours. Why on earth would we even be comparing?
Right. And yet we do, right? I mean,
And
people,
yet we do, and yet we do.
and I think that there's, I mean, just to kind of broaden this beyond like a death of a loved one, there's,
Right.
leaving of children, divorce, breaking
Right.
up with a girlfriend or a boyfriend.
So for me, they're still all death.
Yeah.
A divorce is the death of a marriage. A breakup is the death of a relationship. A job loss is the death of that work environment for you. Estrangement is the death of the relationship as you knew it. Families not getting along, I mean, they're all very real. And so we have to feel what comes up for us.
Mm-hmm. So I think that at the time when, irrespective of which event that we're talking about, it can be any of the ones that we just
Right.
talked about. It could be like the death of the Thanksgiving I used to have. It could be
Correct.
anything,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
How does one? You mentioned this in your book, and I really enjoyed your answer. So I want the listeners to hear it too. I mean, how long does grief take? Because I remember at the time, I remember calling my friend and going like, "Okay, how awful is this going to be? How long until I feel normal again?" Because I was, and I want you to share your answer, having
So
experienced
people
it.
ask me, how long will I grieve, or how long will someone grieve? My friend, my sister, my husband, my wife. My answer is always, how long are they going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time. There's no timeline in grief.
Yep. Okay.
There's no timeline in grief. It doesn't mean we will always grieve with pain. My goal is to help people grieve with love eventually. But we are going to grieve with pain, and we're going to forever miss them. I'm going to forever miss my son. Aren't you going to forever miss your dad?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not going away. We're not moving on. We're not getting over it. Our loved ones aren't a cold or a flu to recover from. We're going to learn to live with that loss.
Mm-hmm.
And I also believe when my son died, I didn't stop loving him. I also don't believe you stop loving your father. We don't stop loving those who have died. I actually don't believe they stop loving us either. We knew how to love them in their presence. Part of grief is to learn how to love them in their absence.
Mm-hmm.
And we're a grief illiterate society. We don't know how to do that.
That's very true. That's very, very true.
I mean, I say in some ways, I'm teaching people what our great grandparents knew, how to be with the dying, how to be in grief, how to live again after grief. That's what I'm teaching people, is how to do that for one another.
And I want to touch upon another thing that you have in your book, Finding Meaning, because, I had a friend whose partner, her dad died, and she's like, "Oh, she's just not grieving in the right way." And I was
Right?
like, "What way is that?" I mean,
Right.
and I think that people do feel like, "Why aren't you crying? This is not the right way. You need to," like, there's all this shoulds, have tos.
Right.
Is there a particular
There
way?
there is no right way to grieve. There is no one way to grieve. There is no one grief model. The right way to grieve is your way, at your own pace, in your own time.
Yeah, I can tell you so when my dad died, I cried. I mean, I cried very hard for like a month, and then I just shut down and just focused on work. Because like, if I figured that if I continued down the path that I was going, I would just down spiral into like just a pool of water.
Right.
And so I just kind of focused on work. And then I thought, okay, well, I grieved, I moved on. That was my thing. It was a month, I moved on. And then I was in a
If only it was that
I
neat.
know. Then it was a silent meditation retreat, and I think I was 32, and I don't think I cried as heavy. I just sat there, like I swear there was a half a Kleenex box worth of material that I was just processing, and it was interesting because I didn't think, like, I was so shocked that 30 years, like, I don't know how many years after, I could still be feeling that deep love and pain.
Pain, right.
Yeah. But and then even when my children left, I was like yet feeling it
Right.
again. And what's so interesting, I'm finally an empty nester now. And this time around, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to walk the Camino. So I walked 500 miles. And during that time, I had 4 gigantic crying jags. What they were about, I don't really even know. All I know is that I was taking pain that was inside of me and just cathartically
Right.
letting it out. And what's interesting about that process of grief, which I've never done anything like that, was that I basically came home, and the very first time when my son left, I couldn't even look at his room. It's like the equivalent of the
Right.
chair in Thanksgiving that's missing, or whatever. Um, but it's interesting. I have no idea how that grief process worked, but it was one that was very
Right.
foreign to me.
Well, I got to tell you, that's the thing. We think we need to know how.
Yeah,
You know, I tell people you come from a long line of dead people.
yeah,
You know, your ancestors have all done this successfully.
yeah.
There's a part of our soul, our psyche, our emotions. We know how to take a lot of hits this lifetime. We're actually built for loss. We think we have to figure it out. And, you know, if people think they have to figure it out, that's part of my work. Okay, you think you have to figure it out? I'm going to give you ways. But, you know, there's a part of us that naturally knows how to do it. By the way, you and I are talking about this like, oh, do this, this, and this. This is hard work. Just know, even in addition to the book, for people who want to deal with their pain, be present for the grief, find the meaning, honor their loved one, I put together, in addition to the book, a free companion class
Oh,
that
perfect.
anyone could get at sixthstage.com, SIXTH stage, sixthstage.com, or my website, grief.com. So it can really take people through this. And one of the stories that I was fascinated by that I put in the book is I did not know that buffaloes, when a storm is coming, actively decide to run into the storm. Because by running into the storm, they minimize the intensity and the time in the storm. In our modern world, we run from grief, thinking the longer we run from it, maybe we'll outrun it.
Mm,
Instead of going, my loved one has died, my children have left, my husband divorced me, my wife has done this, my job is over, to go, let me just be in the storm. There's clearly rain happening. Let me be in the rain today. But let me not run from it, because I will continue to grow. And that's really, to me, what the book is not about going into the post-traumatic stress, but finding the post-traumatic growth.
right. But I think growing into it, that's what the Camino was for me. I just went in
Right,
like, I
right,
know this is going to be, this
right,
is going to be hard.
right,
Lean in, and you're around everyone who's grieving.
right.
And
Of
that's
course.
actually what helps the community of people grieving, never even talking about the grieving, but being with each other and somehow witnessing each other, not even saying a word.
But I want to tell you something I hear all the time.
Yeah.
People will say to me, I'm in grief, and now I'm talking about it, and everyone around me is in grief too.
Yeah.
There's something about, we don't realize we're in a world of people who are in grief all the time.
Mm.
And it's not till you become open about your grief and you talk about it that you realize how much grief is around you. When your mother dies, and all of a sudden everyone else at work is talking to you about their mother's death, and you're like, wait, when did all their mothers die? We didn't have the awareness. We're sort of not attuned to grief
Yeah.
until we're in it. Then we see, whether it's your walk or just life,
Yeah.
there's always grief around us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So we've been talking to David Kessler, and we've been talking about his book, Finding Meaning, and you can go to grief.com or sixthstage.com to get some more help. And you have classes that you have as well, right?
I have online classes. One of the things, they're nominally priced, but online, I never turn anyone away for lack of funds. I want to make sure anyone who's in grief and needs help, that we're there for them. And online has become the new town square. So it's a way to connect with other people who are ready to talk about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the beautiful work that you do, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for doing this.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show, and would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.